Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our first Reimagine Retail Chicagoland's webinar entitled New Results from the Stable Scheduling Study, an Impact on Retail Employers and Employees. I'm hoping you all can hear me. My name is Cindy Solitro, and I'm the Program Director for Reimagine Retail Chicagoland, which is a workforce initiative helping to improve the quality of jobs for workers in entry-level positions. Our collaborative of 10 Chicago organizations is also spearheading the creation of career pathways for advancement in retail and related sectors and working with retailers to increase retention of their employees. This webinar on the groundbreaking stable scheduling study is just one of many examples of the work our initiative is doing to overall change the perception and future of retail. I'm excited to be co-hosting this session today with Women Employed, one of our initiative partners who has been at the forefront of facilitating fair scheduling best practices and other win-win strategies in the workplace. So now I'd like to kick things off by introducing Sharmili Majmudar, Interim CEO of Women Employed, who will review our housekeeping items and introduce our speakers. Sharmili, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. We're excited to be partnering with Reimagine Retail Chicagoland to bring you this webinar and share the newest learning from the Stable Scheduling Study, a groundbreaking look at the impact of scheduling practices on the business bottom line, as well as on employee satisfaction and well-being. Before I introduce Susan Lambert, I'd like to point out to you that you can submit questions throughout the webinar via the Q&A in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. We will have time at the end of for a question and answer session, and we'll be answering your questions at that time, but you can submit them throughout the webinar. Additionally, we will be recording the webinar and making it available via Reimagine Retail Chicagoland within the next couple of weeks. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Women Employed. Founded in 1973, our mission is to improve the economic status of women and remove barriers to economic equity. We envision a world in which all women can advance economically and achieve their aspirations, and we believe that all of society will benefit when this dream becomes a reality. Stability in scheduling for hourly employees is one way to help working women advance. Working women frequently report the difficulties of juggling the demands of their jobs while also caring for families, attempting to work second jobs, and going to school. For hourly workers, instability in scheduling practices makes maintaining an already delicate balance of work, family, education, and more nearly impossible. And nearly 40% of retail workers report that they don't get set minimum hours per week, and a quarter are scheduled for on-call shifts. These practices can result in greater turnover, more absenteeism, and a less productive workforce. In addition to Women Employed's policy advocacy efforts, we work with employers who seek to improve scheduling practices and other win-win workplace practices to increase retention, improve employee experience, and positively impact the business bottom line. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Susan Lambert from the University of Chicago, a longtime Women Employed partner and expert on scheduling practices in retail, as well as other industries. Susan Lambert is an associate professor in University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration and director of the Employment Instability, Family Wellbeing, and Social Policy Scholars Network, INET, at the university. Lambert studies how employer practices shape the quality of low-level jobs, the lives of low-paid workers, and inequality in society. Her research includes randomized experiments conducted in partnership with national retailers, like we'll be hearing about today, comparative policy evaluations and analyses of nationally representative surveys that incorporate new questions about work schedules, ones she helped develop. The sites for Lambert's research span both production and non-production industries, including retail, hospitality, financial services, transportation, and manufacturing, and both publicly held and family-owned firms. As a leading researcher on work schedules and hourly jobs, she regularly advises policy organizations, labor groups, employers, and government officials on strategies to improve scheduling practices in ways that balance the needs of employers for labor flexibility and the needs of workers for stable and predictable work hours. Dr. Lambert will report new results today from an experiment with Gap Incorporated of how an intervention designed to improve work schedules in hourly retail jobs affected associates' health and well-being. And these results complement early findings that the intervention had positive business outcomes, which she will also review in brief. Welcome, and thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you. I want to begin with some acknowledgments and gratitude. I want to thank Sharmili and to Cindy and Chicagoland Reimagine Retail for the opportunity to discuss our results. I'm really excited to have two people from GAP here today, Stephanie and Randall, to participate in this call to get their take on the results. I also want to thank our wonderful research team. We really had an interdisciplinary team with Joan Williams, who is a legal and work-family scholar, and Sarah Bada-Kasavan, who's an operations researcher on the faculty of the UNC School of Business, and our great team of research associates, especially Peter Vergil, who ran a lot of the stats that I'm going to present today. And of course, I want to thank our funders because they're always very important to this kind of effort, and to the GAP for taking a risk with us, participating in a randomized experiment focused on changing scheduling practices that affect the labor. Takes foresight and I think a lot of guts. Today, what I'm going to do is to review findings that we presented in a report that we issued in March of 2018. And those results focus on the effects of the stable scheduling study intervention on sales and labor productivity. And then I'm going to present new results on the effects of the intervention on sales associate health and well-being, including looking at some subgroup differences to look at who benefited the most from the intervention. So, but first, why target work schedules for improvement? Well, Sharmili already reviewed some of the reasons. From an HR perspective, unpredictable and unstable work hours can undermine employee engagement and retention. They can also undermine employees' quality of life by making it difficult to arrange childcare, attend classes, and to study for your classes, to hold a second job, to earn an adequate living. From an operations perspective, labor constitutes about 80% of controllable costs in retail. And pretty much in the recent past, the focus has been on controlling front-end labor costs. So keeping a very tight match between staffing levels and demand and trying to keep outlays for labor low. But there's increasingly recognition and some hard evidence that labor can be over-optimized, that achieving too tight a match can depress sales and fuel back-end costs, such as turnover and poor service. So scheduling and staffing are important for people, and they're also important for business reasons. Our partnership with GAP, people often want to know the backstory of it, and it began with Joan Williams talking with corporate HR staff in San Francisco. She's in San Francisco, GAP headquarters are in San Francisco, and she began talking with them about the possibility of trying out new approaches to scheduling hourly workers in the stores. After getting initial interest from the GAP and approval to start thinking about different strategies, we conducted interviews. Our team of researchers conducted interviews with store managers in San Francisco and Chicago, pretty much all of them, to get their input on scheduling issues that they face at the GAP, and also to combine that with information we had from prior research of studying retail workers themselves. I've been pretty much studying service workers and especially retail workers for the last 15 years. We also began weekly meetings with corporate HR, IT, and operations staff to see what was possible to do. And with all those voices combined, we developed a multi-component intervention and pre-tested it in 3 San Francisco stores. And our goal was very much to identify a way to balance the needs of those frontline managers for labor flexibility to meet changing business demands with the needs of workers for more stable and predictable hours. We began the experiment in San Francisco in the fall of 2015. Chicago joined in February of 2016, and the experiment ran for about 6 to 9 months. The focus of our interventions has been on improving multiple dimensions of work schedules all at the same time. Consistency, which means working the same days, times, and number of hours from week to week. Predictability, being able to anticipate when you'll work and when you won't. Adequacy, getting enough hours to support yourself. And input, having a say into when you work and when you don't. And we focus on multiple dimensions because research shows that changing just one aspect is unlikely to make a difference. These dimensions work together, and just a quick example is that inconsistent work hours are not necessarily a problem. When they're under employee control, we call that flexibility, and it's something that all of us want. But if they're under employer control, it's experienced more as instability. This, you can work the same 4-hour shift every week. It's consistent, it's predictable, but you're likely enough, you're not working enough hours to earn, to be able to pay your bills. So all of these things work together. And so we developed a multi-component intervention that targeted these different dimensions of work schedules, and we saw these all as working together. We pre-tested intervention with 7 components, which I'll go over in just a minute, to change these different dimensions of work schedules. And if you look at the ones in blue, those were actually rolled out by Gap to nationwide to all stores in the U.S. As we were entering the field with our other interventions. So I will review what each of these are, but we can't separate out the effects of any one of these because they all work together, and I want to emphasize that. So there were 2 changes that occurred enterprise-wide. One was the elimination of being able to schedule on-call shifts, and basically Gap just disabled the ability of managers to schedule those shifts in the software. The other company-wide change was advance notice, which is targeted at increasing predictability. Schedules were published at least 14 days in advance, which meant that associates also had to submit their request for planned time off more than 2 weeks beforehand. Just to say that managers were pretty skeptical at first at both of these changes, but the majority, at least, of the managers in our study by the end were converted to see the benefits of both of those enterprise-wide changes in both control and treatment stores. And apart from 3 outlier stores, nearly 90% of schedules were published at least 2 weeks in advance during the course of our experiment in both control and treatment stores. So in addition to these 2 enterprise-wide changes, we have 5, what we call our 5 stable scheduling study intervention components, and these were done in treatment sites. One was a tech-enabled app which allowed associates to post shifts that they didn't want, to pick up shifts their co-workers had posted. And a key thing was that both associates and managers could post shifts. For associates, then, that gave them more control over when they worked and when they didn't. And for managers, it talked about how that helped replace the loss of those on-call shifts because they could post extra hours and then employees could voluntarily pick them up. Another component, 2 other components were targeted at improving consistency and predictability. One of them was a stable shift structure, and that was having the manager establish consistent start and end times for store shifts. So having early morning shifts for a store begin at 5 a.m., morning shifts were 9:30, afternoon 1 o'clock. And except for some slight changes, usually employee-driven, that consistency benefited both associates and managers because one of the things we learned early on is that some shifts would start at 1:15. Associates might forget that it was 1:15. They thought they had to be there at 1:30, which was what they had to be there the day before, and they would be late. And that managers told us they were always running to the back room to see who was coming and when, because they didn't know when shifts were going to be changing. The core schedule complemented this component in that once we had these stable shift structures, then we asked managers to schedule associates for the same shifts week to week as much as possible. Certainly business needs change, but the goal was to keep some consistency from week to week. And the way they accomplished this was not rocket science. They would cut and paste the schedule from the last week and use it to start this week, making only minor changes. The fourth component was something we called Parttime Plus, and this was we asked managers to identify a core group of part-time staff that they would provide a soft guarantee of at least 20 hours per week. That meant that associates could count on a minimum number of hours, and managers could count on having a core group of associates who were regularly regularly in the store. And you can see from this manager's quote, it's an example of several that we had from managers talking about how useful it was to have this core staff because they know what needs to be done on a Tuesday versus a Wednesday. You know, they know where the product is too. The final component was targeted additional staffing. And Saravana Kasavan, who's an operations researcher, used an algorithm to identify key periods of understaffing in the stores. And then staffing was increased on the floor during those times. This was only a very modest increase revealed by understaffing. Commonly, it was just one associate between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. every day of the week. A key thing was that these labor hours were given to the manager to do the store at no cost to their labor budget. So these were additional hours. What this did was provide some additional hours for some associates, so increasing that schedule adequacy, and it provided really some extra room for managers to be willing to take the risk of creating more stable and predictable schedules. So that's our very simple intervention. What we did with this then is this is a randomized controlled experiment. We had 28 stores in total in San Francisco and Chicago, and stores were randomly assigned to control and treatment groups. The experimental period, as I noted before, went between November 2015 and August 2016. We have a lot of data that we are using to investigate the effects of the intervention on both the stores and on employees. GAP was very generous and open in sharing data with us. From the company, we received monthly personnel data, which allowed us to have hard data on turnover, weekly posted schedules, so what the original schedule was every week, time clock data, that's when people clock in and out every day, and then we had detailed sales and traffic records. So for example, our traffic records are traffic in the stores every 15 minutes. Then we also collected data. We conducted monthly surveys of managers in both treatment and control stores, and bi-monthly qualitative interviews with the managers in terms of how scheduling was going in their stores and other pressing business needs. Among employees, we conducted baseline and intervention surveys, and we held monthly focus groups of sales associates to get their input on what was going on in their stores as well. Then from the app company, Shift Messenger, we received all the transaction data, which means every shift that was posted, every shift that was picked up, who did it, when, and what happened to that. So we have a lot of data that we use in evaluating the effects of this intervention. So a key question is, did it make a difference? Did work schedules improve? And you can see more details on this in the report we issued in March. Basically, what we find is that schedule consistency, predictability, and input increased, but modestly. We didn't create absolutely stable and predictable schedules. But what we do see is a significant increase in the consistency of the time of day, increased consistency of start and end times, and the number of weekly hours. We see increased predictability, which is the match between the original scheduled hours and worked hours, and increased input into the timing of hours, especially ending times, and that comes from the employee survey. Adequacy increased, but only for those Parttime Plus associates. Parttime Plus associates saw an increase in the number of hours they worked during the intervention period compared to the baseline period, but not the average associate. And just to note that 50% of part-time associates reported wanting to work more hours, and that was true in both treatment and control stores. The results for sales and labor productivity, which you can find more details again in our first report, is that the intervention sharply increased median sales by 7%. And this is a dramatic increase in an industry in which companies work hard to achieve often increases of 1 to 2%. What we're able to do with our study is to backtrack and look at how was the increase in sales achieved. Well, the intervention significantly increased labor productivity by about 5%. So treatment stores generated an additional $6.20 of revenue per hour of labor over control stores. How did that happen? Well, one of the mechanisms that we found is that what the intervention did was improve retention of more experienced workers in the treatment stores. So now the new results. Did the intervention affect employee health and well-being? These results come from measures of well-being that were in our employee surveys that we conducted at baseline and intervention. All hourly staff in stores in our experiment were invited to participate in the surveys. We got about a 50% participation rate in both ways, even though we had a $25 incentive. We weight our descriptive statistics to adjust for this non-response, and we also adjust for non-response in multi-level outcome models, which I won't go through and bore you with the details of those models, but I will share with you the outcomes. But first, let's look a little bit at who are the employees in the stores in our experiment. Well, 80% of them are part-time, 73% were female, very diverse in terms of race, with, white workers were a third, not the majority of workers in these Gap stores in our experiment. And in terms of age, this is what I would call a younger workforce. If you were 35 or older, you were in the older category of workers in the stores. About half of the workforce was younger than 26 and half 26 or older. So now let's look at the challenges that employees talk about in terms of the scheduling that creates in their own lives. So among parents, who were 18% of our respondents, 24% of them said that their work schedule interfered with child care in the last month. 42% said that they had canceled events important to their child because of their schedule at Gap. People who held an additional job, which I want to really highlight this, with 47% of the respondents, and this group will come back a little bit later, so remember that, almost half have an additional job. 25% of them said that it was difficult to coordinate their schedule at Gap with their other job. In terms of students, who were the majority of our respondents to the surveys, 28% said that it was difficult to coordinate their schedule at Gap with their classes, and 21%, which is about 1 in 5, said that, that their schedule at Gap makes it hard for them to complete their program of study. In terms of health, behavior, and well-being, 42% of the respondents said that their work schedule at Gap interferes with exercise or sports activity, and this was particularly important to our younger workers. In terms of sleep, which also remember these numbers, this will help provide a context for the effects of our intervention later. 47% that said that their work schedule at Gap interferes with getting enough sleep, and 25%, so about a quarter, said that the quality of sleep was fairly or very bad. In terms of stress and stress-related systems, 60% said that just in the last week they'd had physical symptoms like headaches and stomach aches that were not due to a medical condition, and this is actually quite high. That those are very large percentages of people that have these stress-related symptoms. Financial security is also pretty concerning, and I want to point out in all of this that this is not just about the Gap. We find similar rates of insecurity and other problems with health and work-family interferences from other studies of other retailers and in national surveys of service workers in many different industries. So this is not unique to Gap. This is just kind of like a case of this, but think of this as kind of broader than that. So in terms of financial difficulty, 20% said it was difficult to cover basic living expenses. 26% said they had been late on phone, gas, or electric bill in the past 3 months because they didn't have enough money. 19% delayed getting prescriptions filled or going to a doctor because of money concerns. Third, borrowed money from family or friends to get by, which means, for basic expenses as we define in the survey. 44% said they used a credit card to get by, and 6.5% said they had taken out a payday or emergency loan, again, to get by. Food insecurity was, I think, the most troubling. About half of our respondents that had indicated at least one marker of food insecurity as measured according to traditional USDA indices. For example, 37% said that their food didn't last and they had no money to buy more. The third also said that this is a marker of what is called extreme food insecurity, that they had actually cut the size or skipped a meal because they did not have enough money for food. And these rates of food insecurity are much higher than national rates of food insecurity in the U.S. So did the intervention affect employee health and well-being? Well, we have some results on this. We are still analyzing some of these data, but what I'm able to do today is to summarize intervention effects on sleep quality, stress, work-life conflict, and financial difficulties. And what I'm going to report on is I'm going to report on what we call average intervention effects. So that's kind of control versus, the employees in control versus treatment stores, overall on average, and then think about and then look at whether the effects are stronger for certain subgroups, like parents, people with second jobs, and younger and older workers. So the first one, the quality of sleep, you can see the measure. It's just a basic, how would you rate your overall quality of sleep? And what we find is that the intervention significantly improved the quality of sleep on average overall, and it represents about a 7% improvement in sleep quality. This effect is larger for employees with a second job and for employees who are younger than 26. In terms of stress, the measure is a very common perceived stress scale that asks about how often in the last month you felt nervous or stressed, felt on top of things. Basically, if you think about stress, you would think of these items. What we find is that the intervention significantly reduced stress, again, on average overall by about 5%, and it was especially strong among parents and second job holders. In terms of work-life conflict, we really do not find any evidence that the intervention reduced work-life conflict on average overall. What we do find is that the intervention significantly reduced work-life conflict among those second job holders by about 13%. And remember, second job holders are about almost 50% of our respondents in the sample. In terms of financial difficulties, we've just started these analyses, but at this point we find no evidence that the intervention reduced financial difficulties, at least as measured by this one item. But when we look at part-timers, when we take out 3 stores where in our treatment condition that had some trouble implementing the intervention, when we take those out and we just include 16 stores where the managers really made a good faith effort in doing it, what we find is that it did decrease financial difficulties among part-time workers by about 8%. And currently what we're doing is we're examining whether the effects on financial difficulties and hardship and, of course, food insecurity vary for associates in low and higher income households. So to summarize, we're still conducting analyses. Thus, we're really more confident in some findings than others. We have robust evidence that our multiple component intervention improves sleep quality, especially among employees younger than 26 and employees with another job. This is really an important finding because sleep is essential to both physical and mental health, and we are issuing a report on sleep very soon. It should be coming out, in fact, I hope this month. The intervention affected other aspects of well-being for subgroups of associates, but we're still, kind of digging into some of these findings, so I'm going to call these subjective findings. But, among multiple job holders, the intervention reduced stress and work-life conflict. Among parents, the intervention seems to have reduced stress. And when the intervention was implemented fairly well, part-timers felt more financially secure. So those are our main findings. But there's one other lesson that we'd like to share that is emerging from our analyses, and that is that we really think that it's possible to increase schedule stability more than we were able to accomplish with the stable scheduling study intervention. And our analysis really suggests that there is more stability and perhaps predictability in the business that is being passed on to workers. And let me show you what I mean. This is a graph. This is just one store, and just to let you know that store number 120, that's not a gap number, that's our project ID. And this shows how traffic varies away from the median traffic for that store across between September of 2015 and February 2016. So you can see that there's a big jump right there around the holiday season, and then it plummets down, and that goes up about 50%. The store is getting about 50% more traffic than the median during those months. So it does vary. Demand does vary. Now what we add here is total payroll hours. And you can see that they track traffic pretty well. It's not exact. There are other factors that go into payroll hours other than just how many people walk in the store. For example, you see that big peak there that was at this store. They did inventory, and it was all hands on deck for a couple of weeks. But the lines move together. They're fairly consistent. And they're not jutting up that much away from the median. Now the final slide adds the individual workers in the stores. And this is how much their hours vary across the same time period. I'll let you take that in for a minute. And you can see that there's much more volatility in the employees' hours than in traffic and in overall labor. And this is really a matter of scheduling workers. And I just want to say I didn't cherry pick one store. This is kind of a medium store for this. And we have, many of the stores look like this. And so what we would like to have business really think about, have employers think about, is how the ways to deliver the stability that's already there, that's already in their business, to employees through more stable scheduling practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for giving us such a rich overview of the findings of the stable scheduling study. I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit questions via the chat box, and it's in your left-hand corner if you're looking at the webinar. And we will be responding to those questions in the second half of our webinar. We'll have a particular Q&A session. But for right now, I'd like to introduce two people from the Gap who are going to provide perspective from the retailer involved in the study. So I'd like to introduce Randall Gray and Stephanie Riley. Randall is project manager with Personnel Management and Reporting Analytics. He started with Gap in March of 2018 as part of the global store operations team as a project manager, as I said, for Personnel Management and Reporting Analytics. Currently, he focuses on labor strategies for North America that both improve business and improve the employee experience. Prior to the Gap, he was with Nestle Nespresso as a retail workforce analyst and Jake as a GM of operations. Throughout his career, he has been influential in optimizing labor within changing retail environments and store concepts to improve the customer experience while still controlling the bottom line by bridging the gaps between HR, finance, and stores. Stephanie Riley is District Manager, Gap Specialty in the Chicago North region. She has over 23 years of retail experience, starting with Victoria's Secret for 11 years, 4 with Ann Taylor, and almost 3 with Gap. She is passionate about projects that enhance the work experience for her people, and stable scheduling is one of them. Thank you to Randall and Stephanie for joining us. We are going to start the conversation with Randall and Stephanie with a few different questions. One, just kind of in terms of table setting here a little bit. From your perspective, why did the Gap feel like this study was an important thing to participate in?
Well, we felt like it was important for GAP to participate because we knew that there was an opportunity for a work-life balance for the employees. This stable schedule test allowed change in the process of how we function in our daily PM labor management, and instead allowed us to go to monthly labor management, which also allowed general managers to run their store like their own business, ultimately like it was their own checkbook. So not only have we improved work-life balance, we've improved employee engagement and retention, but we've also made the ability of a general manager to be smarter thinkers in how they run their business.
From a HQ kind of perspective, we really thought that was important for us to really kind of stabilize our labor. We knew that we have a very volatile business in terms of moving our labor from day to day, but we also, like Stephanie had said, to make sure that we want to keep the employee experience engaged.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit more, Susan reviewed kind of the impacts on employee well-being and health from this aggregate perspective. From your perspective, what impact did you observe during the intervention or since then with changes in scheduling practices, both kind of from the operations side, but also what you've heard from employees themselves?
Sure. Right away, the stores felt like there was a mindset shift from being less reactive daily to how they ran their business and to start thinking more long-term and strategy. We also saw more associate touch points from leaders to associates regarding their schedule and availability. In addition, there was more conversations about their work value and performance because they were given hours weekly, and in turn we saw increased performance, which led to both better satisfaction from the associate and the manager. Because originally associates were functioning as if somewhat, not like on-calls, but if business wasn't what we needed it to be, then maybe their shift was in potential jeopardy, or we were asking people to go home because maybe the business wouldn't support affording the labor. With this model, we have been able to give a consistent schedule to the associates. We've been able to grow their skill because they're here more, and they are more reliable because they also know that their hours are more weekly reliable to what they're going to get on their paycheck. We also saw associate retention and engagement. So this became the conversation early on about how many hours we can guarantee, and this started with the interview process. So now when talking with associates who want to apply to work at the Gap, we review, if we were to hire you, how many hours would you be looking for weekly? What area of the store would you like to work in? And what would your availability be? And if we were to schedule this every single week and we get the performance from you that you're saying you will deliver, then we can align on these hours weekly, and that they'll touch base with it almost monthly to see are the hours and their schedule, work-life balance, all aligning between the associate and the store. So we saw a lot of increased overall retention and engagement from all of the associates in the building.
Randall, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Stephanie actually said it perfectly. I think we have seen a great impact on all of our stores in the test, and we continue to see driving great results.
So we did have a question that kind of segues, I think, nicely into what we're talking about here, and that is, someone asked, had the piloted scheduling interventions migrated to other Gap regions beyond the ones that were part of the intervention? And if so, what can you share with us about how that has been supported?
Sure, I can definitely speak on this one. So with this test, we have seen a really great positive impact to kind of take this test and bring it to all the brands within our enterprise. So I know the test was just done at Gap stores, but what we've really seen is that we know that this test will speak volumes by putting it into the rest of the enterprise. So currently we're working on trying to understand what that means in order to kind of expand it throughout the entire enterprise, not just within the ones that were in the test or within the current model that we're running.
And were there any, or have there been any challenges or barriers that you're aware of to kind of to scaling the practices to the other stores?
I guess from the HQ side of things, really kind of looking at, what is the appropriate stable model and the stable schedule environment for our fleet, and in terms of like what type of volume are the stores doing, what type of traffic patterns are the stores operating on, what type of customers shopping in our stores, and how do we make sure that we kind of get a really good stable staff to support that customer. One of the biggest challenges that we are facing and going forward is kind of there's a big change management piece that comes with rolling out a test like this and rolling this out to the enterprise, is that retail for years has always operated on such an activity-based type of labor model, and we are, trying to take that model and bring it into a stable working culture, because we know that the retail environment is changing consistently.
Based on your experience and what you've observed and witnessed as well, what advice would you have for other retailers who are interested in looking at, as you said, shifting from kind of the activity-based labor approach to the more stable scheduling practice options?
I assume this question would be perfect for Stephanie to answer for.
Well, our advice for other retailers is to test small and then work your way up. So we originally started the test with just my district, Chicago North, and did it for about 3 months. And then we've added 4 additional areas, plus 2 other markets, so some within the region and some outside of the region. So we started small and then broadening the test market before we can expand to either the next level or company-wide. So that's what I would stress with other retailers, because there's been an astronomical amount of learning where we thought we would start and where we are today has given incredible growth to what we need to learn to continue to make this the best place to work for our employees.
And just to add to Stephanie's comment, we at the HP level, we believe this is the right way to go for our employees in terms of the entire enterprise and kind of moving it forward and along. But as she says, start slow. I think once we kind of expand from market to market, we kind of do notice those changes in the customer, and we notice the changes in the employee environment too, and which stores attract which type of employee. One thing that really is true to this is, what does the employee in that particular store or market want from a retail job, and making sure that we can try to cater that to what we need to as a business. So I would definitely say that's kind of taking it market by market and, making sure that you're nimble on the way to make those adjustments when you need to.
Great. That's really wonderful insight from both of you. We are getting a few questions through the chat, and so we might just go ahead and shift gears a little bit into Q&A, because I want to make sure that Susan also has a chance to weigh in with some of these. And as a reminder, again, to everyone who's on the webinar, you can submit questions via the chat in your bottom left-hand corner. And if you see your question kind of disappear, it means that we've brought it into queue. So don't worry if you don't see it there. And actually, I think Susan wants to respond to a few of the questions that have already been asked and maybe build a little onto what Randall and Stephanie have shared.
I just wanted to say that I think it's wonderful that you mentioned start small, because, we just had 28 stores and we did 6 to 9 months and it seemed small. It wasn't. It was a big undertaking, and you learn so much in just the implementation. There's two other things I wanted to say. Is that one of the things that we found in our study, and probably you're finding as you're trying to implement some of these basic components, is that there was a big difference between larger stores, which have a lot of workers, and the smaller stores. You know, it just meant if you were a smaller store, you might have 30 people, and everybody's pretty much working, and they might not use the app that much because there's nobody else to pick up the shift. And so I think an advantage of what we had was this multi-component intervention, and what we think happened for some of it is that everybody got something. That for, you know, students, you know, maybe it's using that shift and being able to post a shift that you couldn't work because you found out you had to study, or getting more hours. Other ones, you know, kind of benefited from having that more stable shift structure. And so another way to think about that is to, you know, not really treat it as a menu, but if you put multiple components in place, then you're kind of touching the needs of many different aspects of your workforce, and especially in a workforce like Gap, where it's very diverse in terms of where they're at in life and what their needs are. That's a way that just seems a promising approach.
Great. You know, Stephanie, you mentioned kind of the conversation that you have with as you're doing recruiting and hiring, which I thought was also very interesting, that scheduling and kind of a conversation about scheduling was actually introduced at that stage of an employee's relationship with the Gap. Can you talk a little bit more about how that was a change in practice, or you know, what that's meant for you and for the Gap?
Sure. Well, when we started the stable test, we identified a need to have a somewhat formalized sheet that allowed each associate that was currently on our staff to fill out their availability wants, the shift commitment they would be able to give, as well as how many hours they wanted to commit to. We also, on this sheet, asked, would you want a repeated schedule week after week of the same shift, so you could have the work-life balance that worked best for you. So we got so much value from our internal using this template. So I had quite a few stores that started to use it during the interview process. So a lot of times we do group interviews. So they had their group interviews fill out this sheet. So what they were able to do is, based on this person filling it out, they were able to identify if what they wanted from shifts was actually what the store needed as a gap in their team. And then also from that, it set up the conversation, because a lot of times when we have people applying for jobs, they say that they have an open schedule. But when you really say, what would you like your ideal work schedule to be every week, we get a very different answer. So by doing that, it really led to the open door dialogue of what that would look like. And then it also set up then, based on the performance that we would expect to see, and would we be able to give you these hours weekly? And that really set us apart, especially going into Q4 of this year, when other retailers that maybe these same applicants were interviewing for, because certain applicants interview all over a certain mall near their home or something like that. Well, this really set us apart from other retailers who really couldn't guarantee or commit to a certain amount of hours, and they really just said, you know, you could get anywhere from 0 to 20. Well, as a part-time associate looking for a job, and it definitely aligns with your data that you presented, is people can't live off 0 to 10 hours. Some people can, or some people have different choices, but most people were looking for the average of 15 to 20, and it just supported the conversation.
All right, we have a few more questions, and I think this one is for probably more for Stephanie or Susan. But one person's asking, saying that they would love to hear the perspectives from workers on the ground about what they found was most successful or enjoyable about these changes. Is there anything that you can offer, even anecdotally, about what employees said?
Well, one of the things that we did was we, as part of our survey, there's high turnover in retail, but as part of our survey, we followed people who were there at baseline through all the changes, and we asked them especially about the 2 enterprise-wide changes of having their schedule posted 2 weeks in advance and getting rid of on-call shifts. And we had scales on that, and the level of appreciation of that was over 90% strongly agreed that those were positive changes. And as an organizational researcher, I can tell you that you don't really get 90% agreement of positive change on almost anything. And so they very much, appreciated that. The other things that came out was we had just wide support for the app, the Shift Messenger app. Managers loved it, but employees loved being able to post a shift when they, their needs changed, and ones really liked the opportunity to be able to pick up hours when they could. And one of the things that we found that I think fits with something I think Stephanie was saying is that what managers noticed with the app is that an employee who maybe had indicated that they weren't available to work Tuesdays, once they could see that they were picking up hours on Tuesday, that they tended to open up their availability, or maybe they said they weren't available on Tuesday because once a month they weren't available on Tuesday, so they couldn't work every Tuesday, but they could work that Tuesday. And so it provided managers with a more flexible workforce, and it also provided more control for employees and for some additional hours. Now, some lost hours. One of our findings that you'll see in the report is that on average, the weeks that they used Shift Messenger, on average, people actually, compared to their scheduled hours, they lost an hour of work on average. But that's still providing them with more control rather than having to call in and tell your manager. And so those were the things that really stood out to us.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, is there anything you'd like to add from your perspective, what you heard from employees?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing was the more consistent hours on a weekly basis, so then they could have a more reliable paycheck. The current retail landscape functions on a different labor model, so their labor, and this is across most retailers, the amount of labor they get per day is a direct correlation on sales. And with this stable labor test, it doesn't mean that that is necessarily different, but we're managing smarter on the month versus the day-to-day. So the associates could have more consistent hours, and so if they were scheduled for 15, in really 95% of the cases, they worked 15 hours. So they were more reliable on a consistent paycheck, which has really just led to greater ability for them to do their job too, because they're there more, they know what's expected out of them every Tuesday and Thursday when they work, they know exactly what they have to do when they get there for the day. So not only did it grow skill, it also just grew consistency.
Thank you. We have another question. Did anyone, so this goes back to Susan and Stephanie again, did anyone see anything along the lines of how stable scheduling increased or encouraged workers to do more professional development, coursework, or training to support their own career advancement?
So we do not have data on that. We did not ask about that in our surveys. What we do know is kind of the flip side of it, that unpredictable and unstable hours makes it difficult to do, to study, to complete the program of education. So we don't have, we've got the flip side of it, but not the positive side of it.
Yeah, I would have to agree. As I don't know if we have the appropriate data, even just thinking of my district and the districts in the Midwest region, is it hasn't led to career advancement or additional projects. It's just more so led to a better environment to work in.
Thank you. We have another question. This person says, this is really exciting, and Gap has shown leadership in rolling up their sleeves and trying to crack the scheduling nut. What plans does Gap have for extending learning about any of the scheduling practice, the promising practice changes from this experiment to more stores? And I think you've spoken to that already in terms of going to other stores within the umbrella of the Gap. Are there any further things, Stephanie, that you wanted to add to what you've already shared?
I would say that what we're identifying now is what volume bands and what store attributes make this more successful. So I think that's the next level of what we're trying to figure out, is where can this go, and is there a certain volume store where this could possibly not work? So that's the next step of what we're trying to figure out and where we're going to include more testing.
And Susan, that kind of leads me to ask you, this is clearly a lot of really rich data, and you're also getting kind of the feedback in terms of what the Gap has continued to do post-intervention. What are you hearing from other retailers now that the study's been released and, the initial findings, both in terms of business bottom line, but also now in terms of employee well-being, I think show some definite positive impact of the intervention? What kinds of questions are you getting from retailers, interest, et cetera?
So we are getting calls from retailers, and particularly my colleague Sarah Kasavan, who's in a school of business and who's been studying retail for a long time, interacts quite a bit with not only retailers but also other people who study retail. And there is, especially in the last few months, we've gotten a number of calls from retailers who are reconsidering their labor models and whether or not they have become over-optimized, that they're trying to keep the link between sales and staffing levels too tight in the ways that, as Stephanie was talking, I think it was Stephanie or was it Randall, talking about how it's activity-based, meaning that your labor model is you get, so many hours of labor or so many minutes of labor for every 200 sweaters that come in, and for so many pairs of jeans that come in, and then also based on your sales, and that some of that is very predictable and some of it isn't. And so a number of employers, I would say, are reconsidering that activity-based model and trying to think of ways to allow staffing levels to vary, because they do need to vary somewhat over the course of a week and certainly over the course of the year, but maybe not as much as it is now. You saw the lines for those individual workers and how much they vary. So thinking about how to bring the volatility in individual workers' hours down to match more the real demands of their business. And so we are kind of seeing interest in that. I don't have anything specific planned yet in terms of a next study. I would think that this is something certainly Reimagine Retail. It will be, kind of picking up and talking about.
All right, thank you, Susan. I wonder if you can also speak a little to, I think both Stephanie and Randall really, and you as well, supported this idea of kind of starting small and then scaling according to what you've learned. But even kind of before that, do the findings from the study suggest anything you think that retailers can do immediately?
I think there's growing evidence that, what we see and what we know is that a lot of the forecasts that at least the larger companies develop in terms of what the sales are going to be and when the peaks and valleys are across the day and across the week, that they're really accurate. There are very smart people putting those forecasts together, and when you look at it, they're really accurate. And so I would say that one of the things that companies could do is to have more confidence in those forecasts and to let their managers, just schedule to those forecasts and see what happens. A number of the managers that we spoke with in terms of the tight labor budgets that they had, were very compelling in terms of if we got more hours, we could, quote unquote, sell through them, meaning that if we had more staff, we could, we could have the sales, and it would still meet the ratio between sales and staffing levels. So give us more labor hours. So I think relying on those forecasts, which would allow managers to have more confidence in putting up a schedule that had more consistent and predictable hours, would be something that, retailers could do. They have good forecasts. They should trust those really smart people who are putting them together.
There are obviously a number of different people involved in making the intervention successful. I know in the study you said that some of the stores more fully implemented the practices that were being tested. Can you, all three of you, speak to who you think at a retailer needs to be involved in order to make these changes successful? And I ask that also because sometimes we talk about coming at this from an HR perspective. At other times we talk about coming from an operations perspective. There are obviously logistics and financial considerations. Who do you think are the key stakeholders at the enterprise that need to be involved? And maybe we'll start with you, Randall, to ask who you think.
Yeah, so for sure, this type of movement, it takes an army. From where we started, it started with the first initial idea, spelled through HR, and then we got it in operations to take it to another level, and then it's really important to connect finance. So it's really getting all three players in the room, then bring in your regional and field leadership to get their perspective and to start that conversation, because they're the ones that need to make the change and make the change management happen within the stores. But your finance and your operations and HR need to make the strategy and what is the best strategy to implement in the stores. Where we work with finance is kind of getting on this idea that, smaller, tighter teams will end up with better results. And that's kind of the goal that we set when we kind of launched this project.
I think another voice that's very important is, of course, the worker voice, the sales associate voice on the ground. I can't overemphasize the importance of the associate focus groups that we had ongoing during our intervention, so that we knew both how the managers saw kind of what we were doing playing out, and then from the associates' perspective as well. And associates were very helpful in terms of identifying pragmatic ways to just improve their schedules. Again, a lot of it wasn't, kind of rocket science. It was these, kind of basic, subtle changes when we were implementing that made a big difference in making it meaningful for employees and actually feasible for managers to implement. So I think that's another, getting there, having workers be somehow at the table with all the others somehow is key to really making a difference.
I think what I would also add is that my role as a district manager has been to maintain consistency. So not only in the message of what the test can offer, why it's important, but also the communication. So my message has stayed the same, so the team isn't constantly flexing to direction or intent. They know what they are expected to. I also think a critical player was in every district in this test, we have a key general manager that is basically the voice of the other general managers of just what in their life do they need to bubble up questions, where are they getting stuck, what can they communicate to me or Randy? And so I think that role has been instrumental. So it is making sure that really every layer of the team has a representative to share what they need or what questions that they have to continue to make sure that either the district manager or Randy and his team were all on the same page.
You know, I think one of the challenges that we discovered in implementing it, and maybe you can speak to this, Stephanie and Randall, is that, you know, I've mentioned like these 3 outlier stores and dropping these 3 stores where it wasn't implemented. Those 3 stores were 3 stores that during the whole experimental period did not have a permanent general manager in the stores. And we saw enormous turnover in terms of assistant managers and general managers. And that kind of, you know, I think we tend to think over a lot of the turnovers among hourly associates, but we saw it at every level as we implemented this. And so when we think about creating sustained organizational change, that kind of, kind of fluctuation in staff makes it really difficult. And even if the new people come in and they're just as committed, there's a gap. Really, in terms of their knowledge and what happens, you know, what needs to happen. And so I think that's a factor that makes this kind of change really challenging.
And I would support that because one thing that we're trying to figure out is that in my district I have a consistent, strong team. And have our results been where they are in terms of hire due to the fact that we had really strong, stable leaders? And so is that why they were able to execute this at the level that they did? So again, that's why it's so important to kind of test small, then layer on more, because we have some other areas that we are testing this in now where they have a lot of new leaders, and that they're kind of going through some crucial turn right now. And so that's where it's going to see is how did their results measure out. So I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, and just to add on that, you know, I think both of you have made really great points on this. And where we're finding even more success in this is when we open new locations and really making sure that we have a very strong management team hired in and bought into the stable schedule model from the beginning. That's kind of where we're seeing the best results. And, you know, once they're in it, and if they come from another retailer that's usually on the activity-based type of model, you know, it's like a sigh of relief when they come to us and kind of get the stable schedule idea, and their mindset has already shifted a little bit in terms of being able to manage to that. And, you know, in terms of, you know, giving out hours and allocation, stuff like that, you know, we kind of took the approach as like, you know, you have to have leadership, and those leadership positions need to be filled. So in stores that might have had a missing leader or something like that, that's where we kind of get the small amounts of flexing into the associates, where associates that might want to work more than their 20 hours might work to 25 hours to cover that gap in leadership, but the business was still consistently moving at a great pace.
Yeah, what you're saying makes me also think about the impact on managers' well-being. Was that something that you looked at, Susan?
Yes.
Yeah.
We did, because we had bi-monthly interviews with managers, and our research team were assigned, basically we did a caseload, and so they really got to know the managers. And managers handle it in different ways, and I don't want to make too much of this, but a couple of the managers that I talked to the most in Chicago, I mean, one of the things, one store, for example, that did really well at implementing it, in the exit interview I did with the manager said, yeah, we did it because we took on the instability. Instead of extending the shifts of the associates in the store, we would stay, meaning his management team. And so, that's, so the managers and how they're, how unpredictable and unstable sometimes their hours can be. They may get a consistent number of hours from week to week, but the variation in the days they work and in the, their starting and end times is pretty unstable and inconsistent. So that's another, I think, another area that retail might want to very much think about, because if you don't have, kind of stable, consistent, predictable schedules for management, it makes it hard for them to implement the changes. It makes it hard for them to deliver stability and predictability to employees.
Stephanie and Randall, any thoughts on that?
I just actually, I had one that was, when Susan answered that, I kind of, bring my head goes back to me, myself being a GM and ops GM at that matter, and taking on a lot of that instability. And it's like, when we are able to get to this stable idea of labor models, the managers know exactly who's there, who they can rely on, and then in turn they're building these smaller, tighter, more productive teams that they're actually able to delegate some of that instability that might come up to these smaller, tighter teams to be able to execute without them having to work 45, 50 hours a week. So I think that that's something that we are continuing to just analyze and, really get the manager benefit out of it.
And I would also add, I think there's two parts, is that a lot of retailers in the last 2 years, and Gap being one of them, has transitioned to a part-time assistant manager or a part-time manager. And that part-time manager works very well when it is a consistent, stable schedule, so that they know every week, maybe they only work 4 days a week, but they know every week what their shift is. So it's allowed them to, if needed, get another job, or it's allowed them to have a better work-life balance. So I think that's been a role where having a stable schedule has been incredibly beneficial for retaining that role. And I think the other part is really what Randy said, which is, when you have the same people there at all times, then the manager stress starts to go down because they're building skill with their people. And every Tuesday when that manager opens, they have the same several associates. They do the same thing in most cases every Tuesday. So it's building the skill, and then they just know what is expected out of them, so that the overall stress level of the leaders has gone down.
Sounds like you're talking about building skill as well as building team, too. Yeah. We have another question that was submitted, which is, how is the current tight labor market affecting how Gap and competitors approach labor scheduling? So I think that's a question for all three of you. For the Gap, obviously, to Randall and Stephanie. And I think the labor market was tightening during the intervention, but has tightened even more since then. So anything you'd like to say to that, Randall and Stephanie?
I think that's a Randall question.
I think there's a lot of challenges that face what was traditionally the labor market for retail. I think, as we move to the stable schedule mentality, it will turn out to be a great recruiting aspect of it. But in terms of, kind of getting that labor market and understanding what is the new ideal candidate that we are recruiting for, and looking at, are we recruiting the teenagers again, or are we kind of recruiting these college students that want a stable 20 hours a week, but they're, working, they're still going to college. And kind of looking at what the new labor market is for these types of roles. I think, I work a lot with my counterparts in other parts of the world, and they are kind of going through the same thing as well that we are. So, I think we're learning together of how to kind of get these positions more attractive to the current labor market.
Anything you're hearing from other retailers around this as it relates to tight labor market?
There is just some data that, suggests that there is a tightening. When I talk to managers, frontline managers, because turnover is so high in retail, they're always hiring. And it's difficult to find the person that you need to fill the slot that you need. And so it may be a little tighter, but this is an endemic problem when you have high turnover in a industry, and it's just exacerbated, but it's not created by a tightening of the labor market.
Great. Great. Well, we don't have any other questions that have been submitted via the webinar, but I wonder if we want to have any final thoughts from Susan, Randall, Stephanie. Anything you'd like to add to what you've already shared?
I would like to reemphasize, if it's okay, that I think it's really wonderful that GAP is continuing to think about ways to deliver more consistent, stable, and predictable schedules to employees, and the importance of combining this HR and operations and logistics perspective all together. It takes many different changes at many different levels to make it real, and starting small with that, because it is a different approach to doing business, just makes so much sense. And I just encourage, I hope that what retailers will see is that, at least according to our study, there could be real business benefits from trying to strike that balance between having enough flexibility to meet changing business needs and also delivering more consistent and predictable work schedules to employees.
My final thoughts on a lot of this research and the practices that we're doing here at GAP is, the entire retail industry is changing, both from a shopping perspective as well as from the employees that we have in our stores, and making those jobs attractive to those employees. We at HQ are learning a lot more about this and how we need to influence some other departments within the bigger organization that create workload for the stores, and kind of influencing them to get a little bit more planful and more trusted on their business and how they want that workload executed. But I think that we are moving forward in a great place, and I believe that we'll be able to kind of come back in 2019 with even a bigger story to tell with this test.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that, when we were all young, a long time ago for some of us, but, when you were able to have a job, you got to go have a part-time job in retail, and that was what everyone dreams of. That was my dream. It was my first job folding sweaters. And now in today's world, because of the internet, everything is shifting where people have their first job and where they work consistently through their life. And what I think is so powerful and important about this test is we have to shift, because retail is shifting so fast. We have to shift and continue to make our store environments and our company environments just where people want to spend their time anytime they're away from their family. So I think that's just the root cause of the work and why this is so important, and how do we make the environment the best place to be.
All right. Well, I want to remind everyone that the recording of this webinar will be made available via Reimagine Retail Chicagoland. We will be following up from the webinar with a survey that you will be receiving. So please do complete the survey. It's very helpful for us, and particularly given that this is the first webinar in Reimagine Retail Chicagoland's webinar series, it would be especially helpful to hear from you. We also want to remind you to check out both Reimagine Retail Chicagoland as well as Women Employed. You have the websites up there, but we are also on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as LinkedIn. So you have many different ways to stay in touch with both of us. I want to thank Reimagine Retail Chicagoland for partnering with Women Employed on offering this, to Cindy Salitro, and then also a very special thank you to Dr. Susan Lambert, to Randall Gray, and to Stephanie Riley for all providing us so much, I think, information and opportunity to learn, as well as actually make real change in the lives of employees, as well as bottom line impact for business. This is all, I think, really great news, and we're in the midst of, high season for retail. And I think we can see it every day. It's such an important sector for our economy. So thank you all. I want to also extend a thanks to Sarah Labadie, who here at Women Employed has been running our administration of the webinar. And finally, wish to you all for a very happy new year. Thank you.
Thank you.